Good evening, and welcome to the 5th Annual Conference on Help, Healing, and Hope After Loss. My name is Elizabeth Siegel-Cohen, and I'm the Manager and Bereavement Specialist with the Jewish Healing Network, which is a program of the Jewish Child and Family Services, which provides resources, education, and support to individuals dealing with illness and loss. We are very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Janice Meadow for this two-day conference, which includes this evening's presentation and tomorrow's professional training. And I also want to comment that it's such an honor to see so many familiar faces, members of the community who have attended our continuum of support resources for the bereaved, including our Nechama classes for the newly bereaved, our loss-specific groups, our help and healing workshops, which utilize alternative methods of healing, our fall grief retreat, and of course, this evening's conference. The conference is generously supported by the Lori S. Bauer Foundation for Sudden Loss. And at this time, I would like to acknowledge the founder of the foundation, Scott Bauer. Scott, would you stand? So Scott provides a lot of support for some of the good works that we are able to do for the Jewish Healing Network for reaching out to the bereaved. Before introducing the speaker, I would like to share with you information about an inspiring new program of the Jewish Healing Network. The program is called TIKVA, the Jewish Chaplaincy Initiative. And thanks to the funding from the Jewish Federation's Breakthrough Fund and the Fund for Innovation in Health, we are able to offer professionally trained chaplains to provide spiritual support to individuals and families dealing with illness at end of life and loss. The services can take place in nursing homes, assisted living, in private homes, and I wanted to take an opportunity to introduce the members of our TIKVA team who are here this evening, including, and they're sitting over there, Amy Schwartz. Amy, can you stand? She's our TIKVA coordinator. And then our chaplains, we have Chaplain Joe Ozorowski, we have Chaplain Larry Goller, and we have Chaplain Fortune Bellalos, and Chaplain Paul Sager. So feel free to say hello to them afterwards if you like. They'll be at our tables. So we have a couple of tables outside for the Jewish Child and Family Service and also for CJE Senior Life, who is one of the partners of the Jewish Healing Network. Finally, I would like to thank my JCFS Community Services colleagues for their support and guidance in preparing for this conference, especially Amy Rubin, who's Senior Director of Community Services, and my committee members, who are probably outside, but Betsy Lazaro and Marcia Reynes, as well as Deborah Lockett, Rabbi Joe Ozorowski, and Amy Schwartz. So Dr. Nadeau will speak for about an hour, followed by time for some questions, and you'll notice there are some index cards on your tables. So after Dr. Nadeau has finished her formal presentation, if you have any questions, we're going to ask you to take a couple minutes and fill those out, and then we'll have someone come around to answer your questions. And then the other part that I'm going to ask you to please do for us is to fill out an evaluation. For those of you who have come to the Bauer program in the past, this is a new format. We thought we would try tables, a little more interactive. So we'd love to know what you think and just generally what you think about the conference and what other ideas you might have, ways that we can meet your needs. We recognize that there may be some parts about this evening that might be emotionally stirring for some of you. So we encourage you to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourselves. So if you need to grab a coffee or use the restroom or take a break, that's fine. And then we also do have members of the JCFS counseling staff, Lynn Scheinman, who's in the back there, and our chaplains available. So if you should need to sit and chat with somebody about something that is being talked about or just need a break, you certainly can turn to one of those support people. I was hoping to have a podium, but okay. We gather together this evening as individuals and family members touched by loss. Dr. Janice Meadow knows loss personally and professionally and has devoted her 30-year career to helping so many people navigate illness and loss. Dr. Nadeau is a licensed psychologist, marriage and family therapist, and a master's prepared nurse in private practice, providing individual psychotherapy, couples therapy, family and group therapy for a wide range of issues. Her roles have included intensive care nurse, college faculty, researcher, psychotherapist, and author. She is a sought-after speaker and teacher. She offers inspirational keynotes and informative workshops, webinars, and online classes. She is well known in the field of death, dying, and bereavement. Her groundbreaking research on bereaved families has led to the publication of her book, which is called Families Making Sense of Death, which in turn catapulted her into the international stage, and she was invited to join the prestigious international work group on death, dying, and bereavement. So that group is called IWG. It is a group of scholars that meets every 2 years in a different country to promote theory, research, and practice in the field of death and dying. She has presented her work at the University of Bologna, Kyoto University, University of Sydney, plus 7 other sites in Australia and New England, as well as multiple sites in the United States and Canada. Dr. Nadeau's broad knowledge base stands her in good stead. Whether doing therapy, speaking, or teaching, Dr. Nadeau successfully integrates what she has learned over the years about both physical and mental health and what constitutes good care for individuals and families. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Janice Meadow.
I have to apologize to Elizabeth for getting rid of the podium. It would have been just exactly her size, but it was right here and I couldn't even see over it. So that's why we have this arrangement. And I think she did a fine job of managing 10 pages here, don't you? So while I'm at that, why don't we give Elizabeth and her organization a good hand and the many people behind the scenes that have made this happen. You can't have a gathering like this without a lot of behind-the-scenes people who don't always get noticed or mentioned or given credit, and I want to say thank you to those folks, too. It takes a lot of work to make this evening happen, and I hope and pray that my part of it will be meaningful to you. I'm going to ask the rabbis who heard my opening joke this afternoon over lunch if they would be willing to at least smile if they don't think that it was if they don't think it's that funny to repeat it. But one of the main points that we keep making as bereavement educators and researchers is how, whether all this work has been done or not, we still live in a death-denying and by extension a grief-denying society. We don't want to look at that. We don't want to dwell on it. Even Freud said you can neither stare at the sun nor death for long. And so we continue to deny death. We try not to talk about it any more than we can. We try to stay young. We do the things that are anti-aging, whatever we can. And we steer away from that kind of conversation. I remember it, I think it was Woody Allen that said, "I'm not afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens." I think that's a good point. Anyway, it seems that these 3 gentlemen were standing in front of the casket of their friend Charlie, who had died. And the 3 of them, as they're lined up, they're looking down at their friend, and the first gentleman looks at his friend and he said, "You know, I hope that when I die, they will say those wonderful things about me that they said about Charlie. Oh, what a wonderful community person he was, and what a good teacher he was, and all those marvelous things." And the second fellow said, "Well, I'd like that too, you know, but I would also like to hear what a good father I was, and what a good friend I was, and what a good husband I was. I'd like to hear all that." And the third one puts his hand on his hip and he looks at the other 2 and he says, He said, "You know what?" He said, "There's only one thing that I want to hear when I'm lying in this casket and you guys are looking at me. I want them to look down here at me and say, 'Ah, he's moving.'" I didn't check the rabbis. I hope some of you did. But anyway, what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to try to move us up and down the emotional ladder I'll bring in humor. I worry some when I bring in the humor that it in any way minimizes whatever pain you all came through this door with and that you might be feeling as we talk about this subject. But I also think that in order for our lives to be balanced, and tonight is all about balance, we need the humor. We very much need the humor. We have something called gallows humor that is kind of sick humor, but it really oftentimes will help us to get through some very, very difficult days and years, as many of you know far more about that than I do. So I want to talk about just a couple of key thoughts. This afternoon we had it on a whiteboard, but I think there's been, and you all don't have to trouble yourselves with it, the folks tomorrow will, but there's been a great debate within the grief and loss field about what complicated grief is. And there's been an attempt to make grief a diagnosis, to get it into the diagnostic manual, give it some kind of a code, and then there are those of us who think that's not such a good idea and that we shouldn't pathologize, we really shouldn't pathologize grief. And I think I'm old enough now so that once in a while I can have kind of a rigid opinion. My son says everyone's entitled to my opinion. And this is one of the opinions I have. I think that if we would think of every loss that we have from something very simple, lose an earring or a pocket knife, all the way to the loss of loved ones, if we could think of that loss as the way that we're injured or the way that we're wounded, and then by extension we could think about grieving as the way we heal, so that grief is a healing process, not a disease, not something to be gotten over, but something to engage in, to lean into. Even Sheryl Sandberg is leaning into grief now, those of you who've been following her world. Something to lean into, to embrace, to engage. And it is by doing that that we heal from the losses that we have that are really the wounds. Does that make any sense to anybody? And so I'm preaching that. That's the end of my sermon, though. I will say things that are sermon-like, perhaps, but that's the one that I really want to get across. Way back in Shakespeare's time, and I know that there's a great deal that went on before that, in Macbeth, there was a place in the play where Malcolm is speaking to Macduff, and Macduff has just been told that his wife and his children have been slaughtered, and I think that's the word that Shakespeare used. And then Malcolm has these words to say to Macduff, who seems to be just acting as if nothing happened. He's just going along, he's numb, he's not really let the news in yet, and so these are the words that Shakespeare has Malcolm speak to Macduff. And I think it's a good message for us tonight and every day. He says, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers the o'er-fraught heart and bids it break." I think it's just a way to remember. Grief wants expression. It doesn't have to be words, although for many of us it is words. Some people need to do something. They need to start a foundation. They need to do something like the Lori Bauer Foundation, something that remembers the person that's passed. And that is also giving expression to our pain and to our loss. But many of us need the words to actually express it. So that's an overthought that I wanted to give you. And then I want to talk a little bit about just loss in general. Mostly we're here tonight because we've had, you all and myself, we have had losses of loved ones, losses of important and significant people. Not always loved ones, I might say. We're having to be careful in our research not to assume that the person who's died is being referred to as a loved one, because people who are not loved also die. And people who have been abused and have had various experiences do not feel a lot of love toward the person who has passed. So it's an assumption that we can't always make. So a man named David Peretz did a good job of describing just what loss is. And he said, loss is the experience of being without something that we once had or that we thought we had, that we once had or thought we had. And so for the couple that find out that they're not going to be able to have a biological child, they're grieving something that never existed. Not even the possibility existed, but they thought it did. So they have grief about something that wasn't even ever real. So we have 4 types of loss, and I won't belabor them, but I want to at least mention them. Very often, those types of losses are associated with the death of someone. And so I want to just mention the types that David Peretz mentions. First of all, the loss of possessions. I mean, you need only just to turn on the TV and watch what's going on around the world to see how important people's possessions are. A particular kind of loss. One of the articles that was in our newspaper not long ago it said, "My grandmother, the bag lady." And it was about a woman who had had a homestead, and then she moved into something smaller, and then she moved into an apartment, and then eventually she moved into the nursing home, and everything precious to her was hanging in a little bag over the edge of her walker. And so that idea of how as we age, we oftentimes, things slip away or we downsize if we figured out how to do that. But anyway, the loss of possessions is an incredibly important part of the losses. My oldest daughter had a house fire in 1999 on Martin Luther King Eve, and they lost absolutely everything in their home. With they had few things that we found in the ashes. There was a piece of lapis lazuli, and I think there was a little bit of paperwork in a very wet briefcase, but otherwise they lost absolutely everything. And the ways in which that fire and those losses show up now, the kids' paintings and work that they've done in school, and most of all, folks, pictures. Most of all, the photos that you can't get back. A lot of things can be replaced. Then we have another kind of loss that is what we call developmental loss. That loss is when we go from one stage of life to another. I mean, let's face it, just being born from that nice, warm, air-conditioned place where our food is being digested for us, and we can hear pum, 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 our mother's heartbeat, out into the cold room, usually a cool room where the babies are born, and the bright lights and the noise and all the rest of it. From that moment on, all the way to the end of our life, every stage we leave, we have to leave something behind to be at the new stage. Leave the blankie home when you go to kindergarten, go off to school, go off to college. Even young couples with their first baby, they pretty much lose sleep and time and lots of other things. The ability to go have pizza on the spur of the moment, for instance. But it's just the point that life is loss. It's a very big part of it in ways other than death. And then we have the loss of self. I was married as a teenager. I was married at 18, had my first baby when I was 19, stayed married to that guy for 53 years. I don't know quite how we did that. But, I was thinking about my own image of myself as a woman has a lot to do with my early marriage. And my sense of who I am. It's like we were so young, we were like two twigs, sort of grown together. And when Len died, he died in 2010, and I think that's in some of your publicity, that my daughter and my husband died in the same year, in 2010. My daughter in January from an autoimmune disease, and then my husband in the following December from actually the outcome of dementia. We didn't know all of that then, but that's what it was. So when I lost him, I lost not only him, but I lost my sense of myself as a woman. When you go from woman to wife to widow, that's a very large transition to get through that. And then when you no longer have a husband, are you still a wife? If you no longer have a child, are you still a parent? Just that whole sense of identity. And if we could take sort of like we have round lights here. If we could take a circle here, and that circle would represent everything that we are. It's true that most of what we're made up of, we can lose. I remember watching the young men at seminary. We were head residents in the dorm when my husband became a Lutheran pastor. We saw that they came in with their very naive, childlike faith and belief systems, and then they had to shed those to learn what they had to learn to be pastors. And so whatever, our faith, our beliefs, our faculties, whatever it is that makes up who we are, we can lose any one of those things. And each one of those experiences results in grief. And then finally, we have the loss of not only ourselves, but others. And we have the loss to death, of course. We have loss that could occur through a divorce. In our community grief program in Minnesota, we have, along with our Growing Through Loss program, we have a group for divorced people, people who are having the loss of another through divorce, as well as those who are having a loss through death. So we have the idea that we can lose people through death. We can lose them if we divorce them in a particular kind of way. And then the kind of loss that any of you who have experienced dementia, you've lost a parent or lost a spouse who had dementia, you know that you really lose the person before they're actually gone. So it's like they're physically still here, but psychologically they're gone. They're not themselves. I was mentioning to the rabbis this noon, just that feeling that when my husband was in a dementia state and had paranoia, and I walked up next to him, and he went, like as if I were going to hurt him. What kind of a feeling that is, and what kind of a loss that is very different from if that person dies. Not better, not worse, but it's a kind of a loss that is the way we lose others who are still present. And I think personally that it's a very difficult kind of a loss. So those are the 4 types of loss. And very often when we lose a person, we also lose some other things and some other parts of ourselves that are attached to it. Now I want to tell you just a little one. I was in San Antonio last weekend, and I was doing a program for the Children's Bereavement Program there. And of course they work with children, and how I think they see something like 1,000 bereaved children a year in their organization, South Texas. And one of the things that we talked about there was how children understand death. And it seems that there was a classroom, and the kids came in on Monday morning, and the turtle was not moving. And the teacher saw that the turtle looked pretty much like, this turtle is dead. Now what am I going to do? So she thought, and she had a little time to think before the kids came in, and she reasoned it through, and she knew she couldn't go out and get another turtle. They'd know the difference, right? Which I guess some folks try to do, replace the goldfish before the kids get home. That idea. But what happened is she had the turtle in her hand, and she started talking to the kids, and she said, you know, this turtle, you know, we've all loved this turtle, and we've really enjoyed him, and you know, he's gone on to be with his fellow turtles. Our turtle has died, and now he's off in turtle heaven, and he's with all the other turtles, and just having the grandest time. And we don't need to feel too bad for the turtle, because after all, he's with his kind. And then after a while, these kids are all bug-eyed and they're listening to the teacher, and then all of a sudden the turtle moves. And she's done such a good job of saying how great it is that the turtle's gone to turtle heaven that one little boy pops up and he says, "Oh, teacher, let's kill him." So, you know, it just depends. It just depends. We don't want to make the afterlife look that good, right? So anyway, the kids they really appreciated that. I'm going to turn my attention now. Finding Balance After Loss is the wonderful title that Elizabeth was able to come up with. We had a working title that wasn't half as much fun or interesting as that. This family mobile has been with me since, not this one, but the original, which was pretty hokey compared to this, has been with me since 1985. I think I've had it in 10 countries. We used to be able to just carry it on the airplane in a little, like a video case, and it was fine. Now, of course, it has to be all done up and scanned and everything else. But anyway, way back in the 70s, I think it was 74 or so, the grandmother of family therapy, Virginia Satir, wrote a book called People Making. Maybe some of you are familiar with that book. Some of us older folks, it does date us, you know. Careful, if you nod your head, I already know that you're in my generation. I tell people my mom died at 98 2 summers ago. I'll be 78 this summer. That gives me time for one more career and 2 more husbands. Let's see. Anyway, Virginia Satir used the mobile as a metaphor for the family. And she did it because she sees the family as fluid, in motion, and what's extremely important about it is the idea that it is in balance. Balance is not always a good thing. If you look at an alcoholic family or chemically dependent family, they're balanced too. But what happens in families with that kind of a problem is the whole family organizes around the problem, the habit, the use. And so the family's balanced all right, but we have a whole bunch of people behaving in ways or using behaviors to balance the person who's using. So what happens is when that person tries to get sober, the family system tries to keep them the way they were. And I'll explain just a couple of ideas about that. So the idea is that if we think of the family as a system, we're going to say there's a boundary around this particular family. There's only one family like this one, right? And of course, there are boundaries that go way beyond it. The question mark up here is maybe for family secrets. Most families have some secrets. It also might be for the adopted family where there's nothing known about the child that was adopted. So it's a mystery from here on up. I like to use that as part of the story. But anyway, we have a family, and the family has a way of talking. You know that within the family that you came from, there was a way of talking. Every family has its history. It has its way, it has its sense of humor. It has a legacy. It has certain characteristics that you can't say belong just to her or just to him or just to one of the kids, but it belongs to the family as a unit. If you think about it, think about the family that you came from. What were the rules in the family? What were the rules about grieving in the family that you came from? Is it all right to cry? How long can you cry? How bad can you feel for yourself? What kind of attention can you expect to get? All of the above. Are rituals part of what you learned? And so on. So the idea is the family is a unit, and it is more than the sum of the parts. It's not just grandpa and grandma, mom and dad, and each of the kids, plus the dog. And we have a kitty up here. She's staying away from the dog, I think, mostly. That's why she's up here in a safe place. I have a therapy dog, and I have 2 cats, and I try to make the 2 kitties a business expense because they're the entertainment for the therapy dog. Those of you who are cat people might not appreciate that idea. But anyway, this is more, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And how many of you have ever made a trip with kids in the car? Fussy, tired kids, we hear that, all right. So when I say to you that it only takes one upset within that system that everybody feels it, you know what I mean, right? One fussy kid, one throwing up, somebody who's grouchy because maybe dad's grouchy because mom's telling him how to drive, whatever, right? Or vice versa, it can go the other way. But it only takes one, and I want to show that with the mobile. I often say this woman here is having trouble. Her job is threatened, and so she's not very happy. And so when she vibrates, so does the whole system. There was a theorist named Murray Bowen who did the original thinking about family systems theory. And then he was followed by Rabbi Ed Friedman, who wrote the book Generation Unto Generation. And he did more with the whole idea of the family as a system and how something happens in the system and it vibrates throughout the whole system, just like a musical instrument. When you string the strings, the whole case vibrates. It's that idea, and families are like that. In 2010, there was an article in Time magazine that was about how affected the fetus is at a very early age, a very early stage by what goes on in the environment. The noise, the intention, the intensity, and so on. But even babes in utero will feel the effects of that family environment. And then, of course, from that point onward. So we have those 2 ideas. The whole is more than the sum of the part. Change in one part results in change in the other part. And then we have the idea that there are forces within our families, forces that try to keep things the way they were. Especially those of you who are in situations where there's been the loss of a parent. The idea is the other parent will try to do everything that the first parent did, try to keep things as much the same as they possibly can. So there's that notion of resisting change. And you know, if each of our families didn't resist change a little bit, if they didn't push back, you really wouldn't know who a family was. They wouldn't have much identity. They'd be changing with the wind. So we have that notion. And then also inside the family, there are forces that lobby for change. I always think of adolescents. They're always pushing for change, right? They want to stay out later. They want to wear lipstick sooner. They want to break the rules. They want to wear different clothes. They want their hair funny colors. And I guess today it's piercings, etc., right? And tattoos and whatever it is that parents are always happy about. So those are the three ideas. And then we have three concepts, we call them. I know I'm sounding a little academic. I'll get over that very fast. But the idea is that if we're going to talk about what happens in a family and how is balance lost and how is balance regained, which is our assignment tonight, we have to think about what is a boundary. And there's a boundary around this family. You can't see it, but there's an imaginary boundary around this family that makes this family this family. These people are in it, others are outside of it. And then we have what's really important for our purposes tonight is we have generational boundaries, which means we have the grandma, grandpa, this generation, we have the middle generation, and we have the child's generation. And things go on in each of these systems levels that we can describe, and also that if we're paying attention, we can watch some of those things and prevent long-term problems within our families by paying attention to how things get upset and who does what. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So we have boundaries, then we have boundaries between and among people. In my family, we have 4 siblings. I'm the oldest. And then I have a brother and then a sister and another brother. I happen to be just 2 years and a half older than my brother. I had the world to myself before he came along. I had my grandma and grandpa upstairs. I had my other grandma living not too many miles away. And then I had my mom and dad. I had 5 adults to me, which is why my husband said I'm so spoiled. And then Prince Rodney came along. Prince Rodney came along, and he was a boy, and it was a farm in Vermont, and boys are loved on farms because they carry on the farm, right? And so I got used to that. I got really used to that. But the reason I bring that up is my sister and I were kind of in the middle of the family, and we're a coalition or an alliance. There's kind of a boundary around the two of us because we're the 2 females in the middle of a very male system. And so what I could say to you that while I love my brothers, I love my sister more. She's a lot more woven, we're a lot more woven together. If I were to lose my brother, either of my brothers, I would be plenty sad and plenty hurt. But if I lost my sister, I would feel I lost a part of me because it was that's kind of a relationship. Something happens, I get the phone call, my sister. She's been with me through all these losses that I've had. And so it pays to pay attention because when you're thinking about your own family, the people who were tightest to the one who died in the family are the people that will tend to have the most distress because their lives were more closely woven together all along so that the removal of the absence of that person will be felt more. So I always want to know, as a practitioner, as a clinician, I want to know what's the family picture, what's the genogram? Who was in a coalition or alliance with this person? With whom were they conflicted? With whom were they very tight? So that you can begin to say, which of these people in this family do we need to keep a little more close eye on? And so each of you can sort of apply that to your own situation for whatever it's worth. So we have boundaries, generational boundaries within the system where people pair up more or less. And then we have boundaries inside people. And these are the boundaries that help us not to think about bad things all the time and sometimes to introduce happier thoughts. They're the kinds of boundaries that those of us who are professionals have to have so that we don't come home and bring all that pain into our home. We need to be able to have it be at the office. need to be able to say, this is my work, these are the people I'm with today, and tonight I have to go home and be a mother or a husband, a wife or a sister or a brother. And that's called an intrapsychic boundary. That's inside the brain, kind of like silos that we can divide up a little bit, the parts of our life. Back when I was Elizabeth mentioned that I was a nurse. I am a nurse. You don't ever get over being a nurse, that's for sure. I probably do more nursing in my office most days than I would if I were at the hospital. But I remember when my daughter was in junior high, in fact, the daughter who died, and I was doing intensive care, and it was very, very, very quick-paced, very, very busy place. And I came home one day, I don't know what was happening, and she finally got so disgusted with me, she said, "You know what, Mom? You're not even interested in us unless we're bleeding." Convicted. I stand convicted. And I'm sure that that's exactly what was happening. I was very excited about the technology and the acuity in the intensive care unit, and that meant when I got home, my mind was still at the hospital. So I'm not sure that I was I'm sure I wasn't very present, but she called me on it, and that taught me something that I hadn't really put together before that time. She wasn't exactly a babe, but we could still say out of the mouths of babes. Anyway, so let me finish this part, and then I'm going to dismantle this a little bit. And I may need some help with that when I get to it. But I think that's going to be more of a problem tomorrow when I have a handheld microphone. This is working beautifully. So let's say that we'll do what's statistically likely here, and that is we will remove Grandpa and I'll make the points that we've just reviewed. So if we take Grandpa off the mobile, you can see what happens right away. He'll go over here. And so we have now a triangle. And this is an important thing to notice in our families because now Grandma is alone. She's alone. The kids are worried about her. She may be doing fairly well. She may not. She may be doing most of her grieving and her pain in private. She may be very open. But everybody's watching her to see how she'll do, right? And so she has a good son here. He was raised well. He's responsible. He cares about his mom. So he starts in maybe trying to take Dad's place. So up here he comes. And what we say when someone's died at a given level here in this system is it creates an emotional debt or an emotional deficit or a vacuum, if you will. Sometimes we say this is an emotional vacuum, and this son just got drawn right up into it, right? Well, that's all well and good, except look what happens here at this middle generation, this system level. Here she is, now she's the lonely one. And she's a good woman. She's sympathetic. She has a husband, her mother-in-law does not. She's trying to be a good person, right? And yet here she is. Now, several things can happen here. And one of those things is that one of these children is going to get pulled up into this emotional vacuum here and be what we call parentified. Many people who are helpers, people who are powerful people in the world are parentified children. I worry more about the kids that get A++ in a grieving family than I do about the kids that are acting out some. Because they have a feeling that it all depends on them. That the weight of that family, and don't we do it? Don't we say, now you're the woman of the house, now you're the man of the house? We say that to kids. We say that to kids, and we think that maybe we're doing a good thing. But I want to maintain tonight that we're not doing such a good thing, and it overburdens a child. Elizabeth was telling, may I say this? Elizabeth was sharing with us this noon that when her dad died, there were people who would say that to her brother, that he was now the man of the house. And at one of the early meals, brother sat down in Dad's place at the table, and Mom said, nope, you go back over and sit in your chair, that's your father's chair. What a beautiful intervention early on that said, yes, you're still the son. You don't have to take your dad's place, regardless of what anybody said. What a beautiful thing. I mean, what a good mom move that was. It was a beautiful move. So anyway, what we have here is two things to watch. One of them is that one of these kids now gets pulled up here, and that's how that parentified child works. And this can be a very good student, a competent person, But mom is asking her to help her, over-help her with the kids. In some instances, she even begins to talk to her child as if he or she were a partner, treating her like an equal or a friend, when really what that kid needs is to continue to be a child and to develop normally. And that's what happens. That's how a parentified child happens. The other thing that can occur that I just want to point out, and we might be able to think about that in families that we have, and that is mom can get over-bonded with one, you could say over-loving, but it really is an over-bonding. The therapists call it enmeshment. But if mom starts to use this particular child or any one of the children as her emotional support, remember, in her level of this system, there's a deficit. She's needy, she's lonely, she's emotionally bothered, and so it's easy for her to cling to one of the children more than what's normal and natural for that child. I worked with a family where the father deserted, and there were three troubled boys and one baby that was adorable. And that baby became the emotional blankie for the mom. And that worked out for a while. He slept with her, all kinds of things, was much more kind of her companion. And that worked out fine until she divorced the deserted husband and had a boyfriend. And when the boyfriend entered the picture, this young man was completely and totally out of a job. And he got so disruptive in school that it took two people to work with him in school just to keep him in the classes. So it's not a healthy thing when we get over close. It feels like a love place, but it isn't always. So that's kind of what can happen, and what's lovely about it, and you're doing it tonight, that's what I want to say. When we reach out to our own generation, we reach out to other people and/or to other people who have had an experience like ours. I love to be, I'm very comforted by being with other women who've lost their husbands by dementia. Because you know what? We speak the same language. We know what that feeling is like the first time that they don't know who we are. They look at us as if we're strangers, and when they behave. It's a very good thing to be with people who've had that experience. And when we do it, we don't overuse the younger generations in our families for things that are not a healthy thing. So what we're going to do next is, I think I should probably tell you a little Ole and Lena joke, and then we're going to do a little exercise at the tables. Do you know, folks, how many of you have good Scandinavian friends anywhere in your world? Although I see a few hands. Well, I live in Lutherland. I live in the Scandinavian land of the Danes, the Finns, the Swedes, and the Norwegians. And so we have this whole set. We have this whole set of jokes that are about these Norwegians and Swedes, right? And they're jokes that were made up by these people when they left their country and came into the United States. And they made it up about themselves to help them cope with the changes, right? So this is one of those. It seems that Ole's at home, and Lena comes in the door, and she says, oh, guess what, guess what, Ole, guess what? And Ole looks up and he says, what, Lena, what is it? She says, I won the lottery. I won the lottery, Ole, can you believe it? I won the lottery. And Ole says, my goodness, Lena, that's wonderful. He says, what are we going to do? And Lena says, pack your bags, Ole. And Ole says, well, he says, should I pack my winter things or my summer things? And Lena says, Ole, pack them all. You're out of here. Ole, pack them all. You're out of here. Takes a little while to get used to the dialect, but believe me, coming from Vermont, I had to work really hard. Okay, Ole, pack them all. You're out of here. Bye-bye, Ole. So what you have in front of you, actually, I'm going to play a little. I'm going to go backwards just a tiny bit. One of the papers that you have in front of you is a model, and it looks like an egg sideways. And I want to just make a couple points. I won't belabor it, and then we'll go right away to our exercise. This model is probably, to me, the most helpful model to use with grieving people, and I wanted you all to have it. And Elizabeth said, that's not a problem, we'll make copies, we'll get them on the table. The two people who did the research for this are Maggie Stroba and Henk Schut, and they're in the Netherlands at the University of Utrecht. And they've been studying bereavement for a long, long time. And they like to talk about it in terms of coping. And the reason I like this is because if you look at it, there's a zigzag line in the middle. And that's what they call oscillation, moving back and forth, back and forth. And when you look at the loss side, loss-oriented coping, I like to think of that as when we go and we let ourselves be with the pain. We wallow, I want to say wallow and give wallow a good meaning. It's good to enter into the pain. So we are in there and we're feeling the pain of our loss, feeling what it's like to be wounded by the losses that we've had. And then the next thing we know, maybe in a minute, maybe in days, maybe in hours, we start moving this way and do something that we need to do to go forward. And that's the other side of this, which is called restoration coping. And you can read this at your leisure, but the point that I want to make here is there are no stages of grief. Hear me loud and clear. The stage theory that came from Kubler-Ross and has been misused and misquoted for many, many years, there is no such thing in the research now that shows that those stages have any validity at all. And yet they get used in nursing treatment plans, they get used in conversations. I think what Kubler-Ross did for us is she made talking about death and dying a cocktail acceptable discussion. So people do talk more about death and dying because of her work, because of her book. But her stages were actually about the process of dying, not grief at all. So it's not even in the way that she wrote it, it's not been used properly. But people glom onto it because it can give them the idea that there's some lockstep way that we can get better from grief. We go step 1, step 2, step 3, like going through school, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and so on. It just doesn't hold up. And the reason I like it is because I see in my grieving people who come to my office, they will have maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks, when they feel as if they're kind of getting it back together again. They have their feet under them, starting to feel like they can live beyond this somehow. They can find their balance again. And the idea is they can go along, everything can be going along just swimmingly, and then boom, something happens and you're right back here again. I was telling the rabbis this noon, I went to the dollar store. I don't even know what I was buying, but I was totally ungrieving at the time. I was distracted, my mind was everywhere. And then all of a sudden, on the loudspeaker comes the song, "May I Have This Dance for the Rest of My Life, Will You Be My Partner," and so on. And we danced to that from the time I was 18, 19, 20. My husband would ask the band to please play my wife's favorite song. And I thought, oh, wipe me, totally wiped me out. I could feel it started in my toenails, I'm sure, and it was like, and it wouldn't have made any difference who was there. Wouldn't have made any difference at all. So from this kind of nonchalant, kind of mindless state that I was in, all of a sudden, wham, and there I was back, almost as if it had just happened. And so the point is, don't feel discouraged. Don't feel discouraged. If you're going along, yeah, I can do this. I think I can do this. I think I can do it. And then something happens, and oh no, I can't. That's normal. Now, truly, let's not use the word normal. Normal's a setting on the dryer. That's all we know. That's all we know about normal, is it's a setting on the dryer. So we can't hold up what's normal, but what we do know is that it's common for people to move back and forth that way, to have some days, maybe some seconds, some minutes, some hours maybe, and then after a while days, and then something will occur, the holiday comes, something else happens, we have another loss, and then back we go this way again. And that's normal, besides the dryer's normal. So the other thing that we're going to do now is we're going to take a few minutes, and you see this piece of paper that's got, at the top it says, in a sense, it starts out, in a sense, I think you only have 2 handouts. So it's the one that's not the egg. And I don't think it has a title on it, but you see what it is. And I want to tell you what we're going to do with that, and it's going to give you a little bit of a break here, and then we're going to come back together, and I have a few how do we take care of ourselves and others ideas, and we'll have some question and answers. So as you're doing this, if you want to put down questions on the papers you have, that's okay. Does anyone still need one of these that is like this? Elizabeth's right there. So I will, yep, here we go. Everybody will have one. It's going to be a little strange, but I'm going to just read this to you. Maybe some of you have already read it, but just so we can launch into this. In a sense, we are all pastiche personalities, reflecting bits and pieces of the many people whose characteristics and values we have so unconsciously assimilated into our own sense of identity. I think I told you about my sense of who I am as a woman was as I saw it reflected in my husband's eyes as we grew up together. This inheritance transcends genetics, as we can be powerfully or subtly shaped not only by parents, but also by mentors, friends, siblings, or even children we have loved and lost. Nor are these life imprints always positive. At times we can trace our self-criticism, our distrust, our fears, and emotional distance to once influential relationships that are now with us only internally. We internalize the relationships with others. Those of you who like to know theory, that is both symbolic interaction theory and interaction, I'll tell you the name of it here. I just lost it for a moment, but it'll be back. Take a few moments privately to trace the imprint of an important figure in your life, might be someone that you've lost to death, a family member, and then at your discretion, discuss your observations with a partner. So what I'd like to do is, you can see that you put the person's name there, and then you say how that person has affected how you are. What did you take from that person that you have brought into yourself and you carry on? My grandmother that lived with us, she loved lace, she loved fancy things. She was very much a lady. She would get after me for wearing slacks tonight. I think if she were here, she would speak to me about that. And I have a lot of things about my grandma that I attribute to her that are part of me. It was like having two moms because she lived with us. So and you can go down through those possibilities. How have you been affected? What have you taken into yourself from the person who's died? And then what of those things would you want to keep? And what of those things would you not want to do, not want to keep? My mom was a little bit judgmental of people different from herself. I don't want to be that way. My dad had anybody who was very different from him, and he didn't understand them. He would label them in ways that I didn't particularly appreciate. So I don't want to keep those characteristics. My dad was also very impatient when he got tired. I try really hard not to be. So that's kind of the idea of all of this. And just ignore the variations and extensions part at the bottom. I wanted to leave that on there because it gives you a couple of ideas. One of the things that helps us when we lean into our grief, is to do some kinds of exercises and such, to engage some things about the losses. It took my son-in-law 5 years to write something about his wife who died, but he wrote a wonderful piece about how courageous she was and how that was a particular kind of courage when you fight for 20 years against an autoimmune disease, even if you lose in the end. And so take a look. Let's see, I have 25 after. Is that right? Let's take about 5, 6, 7 minutes, just alone first, if you don't mind. And then we'll call it, and then we'll ask you, if you wish, to talk to somebody beside you. I think if you try to do the whole table, it might be too big, but try to get close enough to somebody, and if it's uneven in your table, just turn around. That chances are the table behind you will be an uneven number 2. How does that sound? Are you willing to do that? That work? Okay, let's start, and we'll blow the whistle or something in about 6 minutes. One of the questions that we have here is, doesn't the loss of an adult child to suicide add a different dimension? It adds many different dimensions, actually. Again, what I want to say about that is the people that understand what that's about and understand what to do about it are the other people who've had losses of that same nature. It's not the same. I can't begin to say to anyone whose child has completed suicide that their experience is like my daughter's, who was 20 years ill, and we had lots of time to talk about her life and what she wanted, and a lot of time to process it. And I think one of the ways that we have to do something like tonight, we have an hour and a half together about. And so it's difficult to go into the detail that you would like, any particular person would like, around a particular kind of a loss. And so I'm sure there are resources. You're such a resource-rich community that I'm sure there is resources for you where you could follow up around specifically what it's like to lose a child, because our message is we're supposed to keep them safe no matter what, right? But we can't always do that. And certainly with the drug situation the way it is, we really, many more parents will be suffering losses not different from this. And then another question is, in connection with the loss of an adult child, is there any time frame when the grieving process gets easier? And I like that question partly because it doesn't say over. It says, when does it get easier? And I'm not sure about easier. I have a theory. This is, again, the older woman's opinion, right? This is my opinion. What I've noticed, and I've found other clinicians who think that it's not too different, there's something about 3 years, and it doesn't mean we're over anything, but there's something stabilizing that occurs around 3 years. I've seen it over and over and over. I didn't even pay attention to it at first in my clients, but now I notice. And when somebody starts doing something new, maybe they clean the basement, maybe they clean the attic, maybe they get a job or change jobs, or they do something dramatically different. And I don't think it's a good idea to put any time on grief, because that suggests that we should be able to kind of get our feet under us, or something should be different by that time, and it often isn't. It's, as Paul Rosenblatt, my academic advisor, says, you know, it is when we're studying grieving families, or families in general, it's not in the generalities. It's not what we can say about all families. What's important is the particulars of each situation, the particulars of each family. And you know yourself that your circumstances of the losses that you're here tonight about are unique to you. And they have all kinds of arms and legs on them. There are factors that you can't begin to even convey that make your particular loss different from the loss of other people. So our efforts to standardize or to categorize or normalize some of these processes really end up being fairly unhelpful and sometimes harmful, actually. And so we look to the research, we look to clinicians who keep up with the research, and we hope that we can find ways to help people bear what they've experienced as best they can. Could you please repeat from the beginning your words on complicated grief, I think. There's a debate in the field about whether or not there is such a thing as complicated grief, as if it is a diagnosis like depression or anxiety. There are many people who think there are a few grievers whose grief is that are so unhealthy that there is somehow a pathology or a disorder that has to do with their grief. There are others that say, no way, no way. What we're doing is we're making grief a disease and we're giving it a label so insurance can cover it or pills can be prescribed for it. And so I say only that there is that. I happen to come down on the side of keeping grief as a healthy condition. And as my friend in Melbourne, Australia says, grief is not complicated, people are. And I think she's got a good idea. They don't have the insurance problem in Australia that we have here. So they don't have the same push and they don't live on as many meds as we do here. So big farm is not as powerful in Australia, and so they can have an easier time keeping grief as a healthy, healing condition, and we can't. We are burdened by that. So the 4 types of loss, whoever had that one, here are the 4. One type of loss is possessions. One is developmental loss. One is loss of self, and one is loss of other. And the man whose work I use about that is named David Peretz, P-E-R-E-T-Z. So, what type of loss is the loss of health? Would it be self or developmental? I think self. Not everyone in a particular developmental stage becomes unhealthy in the same way. So I don't think it's a developmental process, although as we grow older, we have more health issues. I discovered about a year ago that I have a 42% chance of fracturing my spine or my hip because I have osteoporosis, which is why I'm in grandma's shoes up here. Instead of climbing up and down these stairs in heels, I'm not really keen on another fractured ankle. So I don't think that it's developmental. I think it has to do more with the loss of self. While I had fun on my knee scooter, my knee roller for a while, I did feel pretty damaged when I fractured my ankle. Let's see, family balance. How is the family balance affected when a relationship is already strained and there is a loss? I think it's important. One of the reasons we wanted you to do that life print was to say that when someone dies, it's not all about the good things about them. Sometimes we're in conflict with the person who died. That's why we can't always assume the language of when your loved one dies, because it eliminates people where there aren't feelings of love for the one who's deceased. And it makes them feel real crazy at a funeral when the person who's died is sanctified by whomever is doing the service. It says, I know a lot of bad things about this dude, and it's not showing up here. And it isn't real to me. It isn't my grief. It's not the real picture. So it's a challenge for clergy. It's a challenge for others. Let's see, one more. In your practice or at conventions and conferences, is grief over abortions discussed? Yes, it is. And again, grief over abortions is a very difficult one. Again, because people have such dramatic reactions to it. Some people go through having an abortion seemingly unscathed. Other people have no problems at a time, but as they get older, it becomes a problem. And once again, I want to say it's not in the generalities, it's in the particulars. You have to know the whole story. There's a whole area of medicine now called narrative medicine, which is really gaining ground. Columbia is where the experts are. They're teaching it to medical students, to residents, and it means something that we all kind of knew already. The important thing about any condition or disease or symptoms is the whole story about it. How did it begin? How has it affected us? Not just how bad is your headache on a scale of 1 to 10, and when was the last time X happened. It's the whole story that comes with a given illness or a given symptom. And that's narrative medicine, and we're going to hear more about it. Maybe some of you have been reading about it as it is. I ask because my mother had double grief after my brother died, age 39, because she never grieved an abortion. And I like that point because, not that that's the case, but I like the point because one of the things that triggers our grief from the past, our experiences of loss from the past, is when something else happens. And when something else occurs, it's like it stirs it all up again. Sometimes a movie will do it. Sometimes a friend's loss will stir us up as well. I certainly see that. I have referrals from the University of Minnesota of couples where one's been diagnosed with pretty serious dementia, early stages, but dementia. And I look at them on that couch and I think, oh my word, if you only knew what you have ahead. I just want to do everything I can to help them get through it. I want to pick them up and move them into a better place and space, and I can't do any of that. I have to be with them in their powerlessness and their helplessness, and that's not always easy, especially when I've been there. As the kids say, I've been there and done that, and I know what they have coming ahead, what's ahead. That's difficult. Would it be helpful to use family constellation theory? A woman who's very academic and very smart about these things asks this question. There's a German therapist who uses constellation theory, which means where do you fall in the family? First child, second child, third child, fourth child. Usually the first child belongs to dad, second child to mom, third child to the marriage, and then the fourth child, you kind of start all over again. In our family, the fourth child is the mascot, and especially if there's some distance between them. But it's a very interesting thing to discuss, and we could have a lot of fun with it. It would be a very good table discussion, actually, at one of these conferences. Where did you fall? How many of you, for the fun of it, are first children? Wow. Look, how many seconds? Seconds? Fewer. Thirds? Yeah, about the same. Fourth? Fifth? How about onlys? How about only children? Any of those? One? Not too many. I always say, oh my goodness, you have my sympathy. If only children, there's a lot of pressure on them, it seems to me. Really, a lot of pressure on them. Let's see if we have one other. And I think you had a question that you wanted to ask. Elizabeth, where's the microphone? I'll answer this one. On the Stroba and Shute model of coping, the oscillation of everyday life has become exhausting for me. Do these authors have suggestions, advice for living in this state of oscillation? You know, as a matter of fact, they don't much. They really are researchers. They like to describe what goes on, and they don't think always like clinicians. I've written several chapters for them for the bereavement handbook, and I like to get into, okay, now that's true, so now what? So what, now what? And I like to know, what do we do with that clinically? And that's not always included in research. It may be implications for research, or implications for further, for theory, or implications for practice, but generally it's not the same kind of a study. It's not an intervention study.
Is there a question?
Yes, this.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Oh, yes, all right. As a grieving spouse, how do you respond to the son who moves up to try and take his dad's place subconsciously? That's a very good question. It's a very difficult thing to know how to do that. I don't know that there's any way except to be frank and direct about what's happening. It's not an easy subject because that's the way this young man probably is handling his grief without realizing it. You know, most of us don't like to be out of control. And when things start going out of control, we reach for control wherever we can get it, right? I often say some of the best groomed people are in Al-Anon because they've lived in a world, in a home of chaos, and they look to see, what is it that I can do something about? I can do something about my person. I can do something about how I look, how I dress, and lots of other things. But whenever you see someone who's over-controlling, there's almost always a reason why they are. Yes, please. We have a question here that's too much for one card, I think.
And I'm definitely going to put you on the spot.
All right, go ahead.
So you mentioned earlier
I better
that...
have a drink.
Yeah, might need something else.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the grief process was really, you suggested immersing yourself
Yes.
into it. But it's unlike when we go to therapy. I'm actually just recovering from a broken shoulder right now. So I'm going to physical therapy. We've all been to physical therapy where we know that end goal, that end result is recovery.
Yes.
Well, there is no recovery or there is no solution to our grief. So if you're immersing yourself into this,
Yes.
what are you looking at as an end goal? What do you what is, you're going to say, my physical therapy is going to last me 6 months, but my emotional therapy is going to last me a lifetime, and I'm never going to get over it. I'm never going to recover. I'm never going to get
Resolve.
healed.
Right.
It's only a matter of coping. So
Right.
how
Good.
do you
Good
think about
question.
that? Sorry, I
Excellent
knew it was
question.
too long to put on a
No,
card.
it was. It doesn't go on a card well. I think that what's at the bottom of that, if I can be a little bit on the stubborn side, and I have been known to be that sometimes, not often, just 3 times last week. But here's one thing. I think that the problem of it is, again, thinking about grief as if it is something to get over, looking for an end point. And I don't think there is an end point. I think for as long as we're alive, something can trigger us. We will be reminded of our loss, something about it, and we will have some degree of grief forever. forever. I just think that's the case. Will we be as disturbed, disrupted, disorganized, whatever it is when it first happens? Not likely. We'll gradually, and I still think Phyllis Silverman, who started the Widow to Widow program in Boston, is right when she says we don't get over it, we get better at carrying it. We get better at living with it. Even some of our physical injuries don't go away, go away. You have to stay in shape in order for you not to have trouble. Your shoulder, if you don't stay in shape as you go forward, you're going to have trouble again with your shoulder, right? So even in that, where there's theoretically an endpoint where you've finished rehab, you're never done with a body injury because it always is there underneath and can be aggravated again by whatever happens. That's not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's true that grief is the way we heal. Not every healing process proceeds well, but it's still, the focus is on the wounding was the loss. The injury was the loss itself, the fact that you lost your wife, right? That's the wound, that's the injury. And the way in which you've learned to cope with that, to live with it, and even to make some good come from it, is the way you heal. That's a real man way of healing, by the way. Our gender, the way we grieve is different, women and men. Men often get more of a feeling of doing it right or making progress if they can do something. And women want men to cry, and women want men to cry the way we do, and men want women to do something the way they do. Heart attacks are male, grief is female. Our women's heart attacks have historically not gotten the right attention because we have different kinds of heart attacks than men do. So we don't get the angiogram and so on. That's pretty well documented now. Women want men to grieve the way they do. We want to see our kids, we want to see our teenage boys cry in order to know that they're grieving. Probably not. Sometimes, but probably not. So I think the doing piece of it is the part that is a particular form of healing. I don't feel very satisfied with my own answer, but I think that we have to keep wrestling with all of this. I think turning it over in our minds. My dad used to say, "Put it in the other hand and look at it," and I don't think that was just passing it from one hand to the other. I think it's turning it over this way, seeing the other side of it. Grieving is a very complicated process, and it affects everything about us. It's like water in the basement. It doesn't stay in one room. And I think it takes time, it takes work. And we do it differently as we grow older. The grief that I feel, even in these 6 or 7 years, about the loss of my husband and my daughter is very different than the way it was when I was 5, 6 years younger. And as I get older, it's more of a problem because I feel it more. It's more real to me, and I feel less competent in the world as an older woman than I did when I was younger. So we change, and it's different to carry it, even. You really got me started. Other thoughts, any questions, comments on today? Yes, please, back there in the pretty blue hat.
I would like to try to empower this gentleman that, to me, it's sort of like magic. You go along and day to day, like you said, you'll be going along and all of a sudden something will hit you and you'll be grieving again. And then you go the next day, little by little, it takes time, but you get through it. It's like quicksand at first, but the quicksand gets less heavy, and you get through it. Before you know it, it's like a weight off your shoulders. You're still grieving, but you're not in constant pain. I got remarried 7 years after my husband passed away, and because I felt like, I didn't feel like Mickey's widow anymore. I felt like a single mother. So it just like it happened. I mean, I did my work. I went to support groups. I had a therapist. My children went to support groups. I raised 4 children. I buried 1. So it was very hard, but you can get through it. It does happen, and I just want you to know.
That's
to
good.
have hope, and you can get through.
That's good, good, that's wonderful. Let's give her a little hand, that's a nice boost. Thank you, thank you. You know, there was a seminary professor when we were in seminary in St. Paul, and he said, when you go to grief group, you see that other people who are ahead of you in some way, whatever you construe as being ahead of us, is maybe because they're just, life is getting easier for them. He said they're the embodiment of hope, the embodiment of hope. Now, I want to read something at the end,
and then
we're going to get people out of here on time.
She's going to read something, then again, I just want to remind you to please fill out the evaluations. We'd really appreciate it. And we want to thank Dr. Nadeau for a very enlightening and moving evening.
Thank you. Thank you. This one has to do with how we take care of ourselves, and we could spend quite a few more hours just how do we take care of ourselves, and really how could we help other people as well. We could do another couple hours about that. But this one is about kind of our own inner, it's called Inner Peace, and I want to close with this. If you can start the day without caffeine, if you can always be cheerful, ignoring aches and pains, if you can resist complaining and boring people with your troubles, if you can eat the same food every day and be grateful for it, if you can understand when your loved ones are too busy to give you any time, if you can take criticism and blame without resentment, if you can conquer tension without medical help, if you can relax without alcohol, if you can sleep without the aid of drugs, you are probably the family dog. Thank you so much.